Hi everyone, I'm Bridget Mullins. I'm the director of the program, the Master's Professional Writing Program. And I want to welcome you all to our first core reading of this semester. And we want to welcome Dana Gioia, not only to core, but to USC. And as most of you know, the core series is connected to our core class, which is our only required class here at MPW. To bringing all of you incoming MPWers together to read the same works of literature and workshop and develop a vocabulary, and we're so thrilled with this incoming class. Before we start, I would like to remind you to turn off your cell phones, and I have a couple of announcements. On Sunday night, Bernard Cooper is reading at the Good Luck Bar in East Hollywood. You can find out more about that on our Facebook page. I will be at the Pasadena Public Library on Sunday afternoon reading the poems of Frank Bedard. Someone will be there reading Bukowski. Someone will be there reading Josephine Miles. I feel like Chelsea Handler suddenly. These are all, you guys watch Chelsea Handler? No. Well, these are all California poets. In the Penn West put together people and asked us to all come out and read some poems by California poets. So I'll be there on Sunday afternoon reading Frank Bedard. And Dinah asked me to announce that on Monday night at 7 p.m., somewhere in Taper Hall. Howard, where in Taper Hall? Monday night.
THH 119.
Oh, so one of those downstairs auditoriums. We're doing a screening of the movie adaptation of Jesus' Son. It stars Billy Crudup and Jack Black, and there will be pizza and drinks. And it'd be great if you guys saw it as a group. I think I'll go and see it, even though I've seen it about 5 times because I love it. And on February 15th, Dennis Johnson is coming to USC. He's going to do a workshop with you guys and a reading. So it's a good prep for that. Also, it's your homework, I gather. Okay. At the table outside, there are flyers and postcards, and other mnemonic devices for our many happenings this semester. And after Dana reads, there will be a Q&A, and he'll sign books, and we'll have a reception in the courtyard. And the reason we're having a reception is because of Howard and Court. Thank you guys for putting this together. And Dana Gioia, I feel so high up, it's like Parnassus up here. Dana Gioia is a native Californian of Mexican and Italian heritage, and he is the newly appointed Professor of Poetry and Public Culture here at USC. He is a recipient of many, many awards, including the National Book Award for his poetry. His contributions to the national dialogue start with his famous essay, Can Poetry Matter?, which was a call to arms about the place of poetry in our time. The essay was published in 1992, I think, and it created quite a stir and is still causing a stir. It's an essay with a very long shelf life. It's a consideration of this particular literary art form in the world, and it's sort of the history of poetry in America in a nutshell as well. And it's a pragmatic look at how to bring poetry into our daily conversation, our daily lives. And this is something we think about here at MPW. Even as we graduate, as we know, mostly fiction and nonfiction and television writers, our students sharpen their skills by taking poetry classes. And I'm just remembering, MG, you brought in the woman who created Nurse Jackie.
Oh, Liz Brixius.
Liz Brixius, who got up and she was talking about Nurse Jackie and where the character came from and where the show came from. And then she told us a little bit, she had an MFA in poetry and she had studied with James Tate, and this is where she learned economy of language, this is where she learned image, this is where she learned surreal humor. It was quite remarkable and very rewarding for me. And for all of us who write poetry on the faculty. Tonight we have Amy Gersler here, and Dana Goodyear teaches poetry here, as well as Nan Cohen. So this essay, I know most of you read it in the core class. And besides his essays, of course, Dana is a translator. He's a prolific editor of anthologies of poetry and fiction. and his criticism has been collected in a couple of volumes. Dana served 2 terms as the chairman of the NEA. He's a person who gets things done. He's created countless initiatives, bringing the arts to all corners of our country, among them the Big Read, Poetry Out Loud, Shakespeare in the Schools, etc. The statistics are amazing. He's affected a generation of young people in activating the government and big business to support the arts. He's a considerable force in American culture. And this reminds me of Yeats, who was also a civil servant and helped shape the Irish Free State, not only through his poetics, but also through his presence. The Irish, like African Americans, had their right to read and write taken away from them, and the language came back with full force in both instances. We have freedom of speech, but our speech is not exactly free, and Gioia reminds us of the place that poetry has in society as a means not only of self-expression, but of communication. There are so many useful and provocative points that he makes in all of his essays, and he continues to make as a critic and as a witness of the arts. But we're here tonight to hear his poetry, and I want to talk to you for a moment about his poetry. His 3 collections are various, yet there's a consistent voice of intelligence and a musicality that stitches the poems and the books together. His poetry collections include Daily Horoscopes, The Gods of Winter, and Interrogations at Noon. His forthcoming volume of poems, Pity the Beautiful, will appear this spring, actually, yes, April 2012. Dana has an ear and an eye for detail, and he reminds us that, quote, poetry is strong enough to help. That's Anne Carson's description of poetry. There is solace and antidote in the lyric, as well as the narrative, as well as the formal poem. Dana Gioia writes in many categories. In fact, he defies categorization and reminds us, as does Yeats, that poems can be personal and political. In Yeats's autobiography, he says, everything that is merely personal soon rots unless it is packed in ice or salt. And to Yeats, the ice and the salt were the elements of form, meter, rhyme, all the techniques and craft that's available to a writer. And in this respect, and in so many respects, we're in for a real treat tonight. Dana Gioia is a real master. Please join me in welcoming Dana Gioia.
Too many things to organize here. Good evening. I feel privileged as a poet to start your mandatory series here. I assume you were mostly brought in by bayonet point, but poets are happy with that. It seems like we put this water down here. I thought I would say a couple of things before I started reading some poems and talking about myself as a poet, which is that I think of myself as a writer, the core of whose work is poetry. But as somebody once joked about poetry, the trouble with being a poet is what do you do the other 23 hours a day? A novelist, to a certain degree, has a very strange occupation of sitting at a table with their imaginary friends, day after day after day, letting their lives sort of work out. But a poet is the sprint runner of literature. You tend to have these short arcs of inspiration. They may take you years to finish, but the inspiration of itself is a relatively compact thing. And the question is, what then do you do with your life? I mean, T.S. Eliot became a banker, then a publisher. Stevens became a lawyer. Marion Moore edited journals. And I think that poets, if they're not like Rilke, and they don't have a lot of friends who are aristocrats that let you live in their castles, the question is, how do you make your way in the world? And for me, that's has been an issue. My parents neglected to give me the private income I so richly deserve, and so I was forced, with the repeated indignities of finding jobs. Perhaps not a problem for you guys. I don't know. And so the question is, how do you construct a life which allows you to, to live in a way that that you'd like, or if you have a family, to provide for your family, but also protects those things that you're trying to do as an artist, and which I think are far more vulnerable than we give them credit. You can ruin your gift, you can't ignore your gift, you cannot nourish your gift. And so it seems to me that one of the necessary things for an artist to imagine, one of the chief creative undertakings of any writer, is to imagine their life, to create a life which allows them, to whatever needs they need to have fulfilled in a way that's consonant with their calling. And what that has meant in my life is that about every 10 years I've had to reinvent my life, because what seemed to have worked until then was no longer seemed quite so viable. And I'm happy to say that my latest one was to escape Washington alive, which is something most men cannot do. It's a kind of a place of addiction for alpha males, and they can never leave it. And I'm so pleased to be at USC, to begin at the age of 60 a career in teaching, and I'm so fortunate to be a displaced person who has found refuge in the MPW wing. A happy little kingdom, sort of through a looking glass, I just can't tell you how pleased I am by my neighbors. Whether they're pleased about me is another question, but they're so polite, they won't say anything this evening. I thought what I would do is read you a dozen poems, and I try to put most of them sort of in the book that you've at least some of you have read, Interrogations at Noon. But I thought I would do a couple of early poems and a couple of poems that will be in my next book. And I wanted to begin with that dreaded thing, a poem about language, a poem about words, a poem about what you can do with words. Words. The world does not need words. It articulates itself in sunlight, leaves, and shadows. The stones on the path are no less real for lying uncatalogued and uncounted. The fluent leaves speak only the dialect of pure being. The kiss is still fully itself, though no words were spoken. And one word transforms it into something less or other, illicit, chaste, perfunctory, conjugal, covert. Even calling it a kiss betrays the fluster of hands glancing the skin or gripping the shoulder, the slow arching of neck or knee, the silent touching of tongues. Yet the stones remain less real to those who cannot name them. To see or read the mute syllables graven in silica, to see a red stone is less than seeing it as jasper, metamorphic quartz, cousin to the flint the Kiowa carved as arrowheads. To name is to know and remember. The sunlight needs no praise, piercing the rain clouds, painting the rocks and leaves with light, then dissolving each lucent droplet back into the clouds that engendered it. The sunlight needs no praise, and so we praise it always, greater than ourselves and all the airy words we summon. I'm a native Angelino, a native Californian, and the world looks different from this coast than it does from somewhere else. It feels different from this climate than someone else. And for a poet, it's an odd situation because the imagery, the mythology of poetry is, for us, largely the mythology of England and New England. Their seasons, their trees, their ways. And, for a Latin kid from LA, the world has a different feel. And when I first moved to New York, I heard a fellow in my office complaining. He got out to California, and they said, "What was it like?" And he said, "It's not as pretty as New England. You know, it's all dry. You know, and it rankled me." A little while later, I wrote this poem, which it just sort of came out, it was published in the New Yorker, where Howard Moss took this, because the whole poem is one long sentence, and he judiciously placed a period at the end of each stanza, changing nothing else, which gave it an elegance it had previously lacked, which it says a good editor helps you. And this, to my surprise, has probably been my most widely translated poem. It's been translated into every language from a country that has no water. California hills in August. Let's just say something. It begins to look at how California seems to an outsider, and then at the very end it turns and shows how it is seen by a native. California hills in August. I can imagine someone who found these fields unbearable, who climbed the hillside in the heat, cursing the dust, cracking the brittle weeds underfoot, wishing a few more trees for shade. An Easterner especially, who would scorn the meagerness of autumn, the dry, twisted shapes of black elm, scrub oak, and chaparral, a landscape already drained of green. One who would hurry over the clinging thistle, foxtail, knowing everything was just a weed, unable to see that these trees and sparse brown bushes were alive, and hate the bright stillness of the noon, without wind, without motion, the only other living thing, a hawk, hungry for prey, suspended in the blinding sunlit blue. And yet, how gentle it seems to someone raised in a landscape short of rain. The skyline of a hill, broken by no more trees than one can count. The grass, the empty sky, the wish for water. Well, it's an exciting response. I've been fascinated by something that is putting together kinds of languages in poems that you don't usually see there. The language of history, the language of politics, the language of musicology, the language of nonfiction. And this is a poem that everything in it really happened, and it has three kinds of language in it. The first is two quotations from a book of surrealist proverbs, by André Breton and Benjamin Perret. And the two quotes are, "There is always a skeleton on the buffet." And the other may be your summary of this evening. "I came, I sat down, I went away." Then there's stories that are real stories and real quotations from the surrealists. And then there's quotations. So there's three levels of language. The proverbs, which you will recognize since I've given them to you. The quotations, which I will do in the voice of Maurice Chevalier. And then the narration. As a quick history of surrealism, the ringleader is André Breton, surrealist poet. Their godfather is Apollinaire, the great poet who was wounded in the First World War. Picasso was a sort of a hanger-on. Marcel Duchamp, who took a urinal, signed it Armut, and put it in a show, declaring it art. Therefore, making the point, which was really part of what art is how we regard an object, versus intrinsic. There's Salvador Dali, whom I think everyone knows. There is also Raymond Roussel, probably the strangest of all the surrealists, a Belgian millionaire who squandered his entire fortune doing surrealist pageants, and also built the first sort of double-wide motorhome, who, when he went bankrupt, killed himself. There is Hugo Ball, one of the founders of Dada, who became eventually a Catholic theologian. There's Paul Éluard, the great surrealist poet flaneur, who steals, from whom Dali steals his wife. Éluard, I think, was glad to get rid of her. And I think everything else is, the Place Pigalle is, of course, the notorious street of bordellos and clubs in Paris. All of this takes place between the end of the First World War and the middle of the Second World War in Paris. Elegy with surrealist proverbs as refrain. See, there comes a point in every poetry reading where the poet reads you a poem you cannot understand. So just lean back, accept it as part of life's pageant. Elegy with surrealist proverbs as refrain. Poetry must lead somewhere, declared Breton. He carried a rose inside his coat each day to give to a beautiful stranger. Better to die of love than love without regret. And those who loved him soon learned regret. The simplest surreal act is running through the streets with a revolver, firing at random. Old and famous, he seemed démodé. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. Wounded Apollinaire wore a small steel plate inserted in his skull. I so loved art, he joked. I joined the artillery. His friends were asked to wait while his widow laid a crucifix across his chest. Picasso hated death. The funeral left him so depressed, he painted a self-portrait. It's always other people, remarked Duchamp, who do the dying. I came. I sat down. I went away. Dali dreamed of Hitler as a white-skinned girl, impossibly pale, luminous and lifeless as the moon. Wealthy Roussel taught his poodle to smoke a pipe. When I write, I am surrounded by radiance. My glory is like a great bomb waiting to explode. When his valet refused to slash his wrists, the bankrupt writer took an overdose of pills. There was always a skeleton on the buffet. Breton considered suicide the truest art, though life seemed hardly worth the trouble to discard. The German colonels strolled the Ile de la Cité, some to the Louvre, some to the Place Pigalle. The loneliness of poets has been erased, cried Éluard, in praise of Stalin. Burn all their books, said dying Hugo Ball. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. I came, I sat down, I went away. Now I'd like to read you a fairly complicated poem, but once again, I'm intrigued by a certain kind of poem which talks to you sideways, that doesn't, just sort of stay, A, B, C, and D, but sort of swirls around the subject. This is a poem. It's in the form of a litany. If you think of a litany lists all the attributes of a deity or an entity without specifically naming it. The litany. This is a litany of lost things. A canon of possessions dispossessed, a photograph, an old address, a key. It is a list of words to memorize and to forget, of amo, amos, amat, the conjugations of a dead tongue in which the final sentence has been spoken. This is a liturgy of rain, falling on mountain, field, and ocean, indifferent, anonymous, complete, of water infinitesimally slow, sifting through rock, pooling in darkness, gathering in springs, then rising without our agency, only to dissolve in mist or cloud or dew. This is a prayer to unbelief, to candles guttering and darkness undivided, to incense drifting into emptiness. It is the smile of a stone Madonna, a benediction on the death of a young God, brave and beautiful, rotting on a tree. This is a litany of earth and ashes, to the dust of roads and vacant rooms, to the fine silt circling in a shaft of sun. This is a prayer to praise what we become. Dust thou art, to dust shalt thou return. Savor its taste, the bitterness of earth and ashes. This is a prayer, inchoate and unfinished, to you, my love, my loss, my lesion, a rosary of words to count out time's illusions, all the minutes, hours, and days the calendar compounds as if the past existed somewhere, like an inheritance still waiting to be claimed, until at last it is our litany. Mon vieux, my reader, my voyeur, as if the mist steaming from the gorge, this pure paradox, the shattered river rising as it falls, splintering the light, swirling it skyward, neither transparent nor opaque, but luminous, even as it vanishes, were not our life. I'm probably most notorious for reviving rhyme and meter at a point when it was really considered verboten. We were told that, it was a hopelessly elitist and literary technique that cut you off from the true language of the people. But, I kind of came from people that had never taken literature classes, and they all liked rhyme and meter, And so it was a very odd thing. Luckily hip-hop came along and sort of, silenced the academic objections to it, but the grudge has remained, and they've never quite accepted it. And so I will really push my offense to the furthest. This is a rhymed poem in a triple meter that is an allegorical ballad. I mean, how many rules does that break? It's called The Archbishop, and its subtitle is For a Famous Critic. And I take as my allegorical story, a corrupt medieval archbishop. And to my surprise, this poem ended up as one of my poems in the Oxford Book of American Verse, something I would never have predicted. I think you should know all of this. If you don't, then you haven't been reading the Bible enough. Occasionally, fundamentalists come to me afterwards and tell me, you're saying that these two things are from the same chapter in the Gospels, but they're not. And I said, Oh, do not disturb the Archbishop, asleep in his ivory chair. You must send all the workers away, though the church is in need of repair. The Archbishop is tired from preaching to the halt and the lame and the blind. Their spiritual needs are unsubtle, their notions of God unrefined. The Lord washed the feet of his servants. The first shall be last, he advised. The Archbishop's edition of Matthew has that troublesome text excised. The Archbishop declines to wear glasses, so his sense of the world grows dim. He thinks that the crowds at the masses have gathered in honor of him. In the crypt of the limestone cathedral, a friar recopies St. Mark. A nun serves stew to a novice. A choir boy sobs in the dark. While high in the chancery office, his reverence studies the glass, wondering which of his vestments would look best at Palm Sunday Mass. The saints from their weather-stained niches weep as the vespers are read, and the beggars sleep on the church steps, and the orphans retire unfed. On Easter, the Lord is arisen, while the Archbishop breakfasts in bed, and the humble shall find resurrection, and the dead shall lie down with the dead. There's one person here knows the good book. Now, I wanted to talk about another thing, which is I try to make my poems as different as possible from each other. And the reason is because poets are the slaves of their weird sensibilities. And when it really cut through it, they've all got about 4 or 5 ideas, and it just ends there, And so I think you need outward variation to get by making your obsessions palatable. And so, one of the things that I try to do is to play around with language. This is a poem that's entirely made up of pre-existing slang. It's about the only subject that is considered obscene in American poetry. Because you can write about, sodomy, fellatio, anything you want. It's just standard poetry, for God's sakes. But money continues to be obscene. So this is Money, as an epigraph from Wallace Stevens, his journal. And it's actually, as I recall in the journal, is next to a remark on surrealism. And it's money is a kind of poetry. Money, the long green. Cash, stash, rhino, jack, or just plain dough. Chalk it up, fork it over, shell it out. Watch it burn holes through pockets. To be made of it, to have it to burn. Greenbacks, double eagles, megabucks, or Ginny Mays. It greases the palm, feathers the nest, holds heads above water, makes both ends meet. Money breeds money, gathering interest, compounding daily, always in circulation. Money. You don't know where it's been, but you put it where your mouth is, and it talks. I think I heard every line of that poem from my parents at one point or another. Another thing I've done is I've worked a lot with musicians, which I think people always think is odd, but I think being a poet is such a lonely business. You want to have some friends, for God's sakes, and the fiction writers are not very nice to you, but the composers, they like you, And so I've written opera libretti, I've done songs. I've worked with everybody from Chico Hamilton and Dave Brubeck in the jazz world to, rock people. But, classical is where you tend to do work. And I've written a number of libretti, and it's very interesting when you actually write words for music, because there's 3 things you have to worry about that you don't really have to think about when you're writing just for the page. One is that you have to create a text that's complete in itself. It has its emotional arc, its story, its images. But if you make it too dense, a weave, the composer can't get in there. You got to leave some room for the composer to do his or her stuff. The second thing is, and this is a very interesting thing, which is that you can't understand every word that's being sung, especially if it's a soprano. Because the higher the voice, the harder the diction. When you hear a soprano that's got great aim, you just want to worship her. But so there's a certain amount of attrition. So you've got to create a syntactical structure or a verbal structure where if you lose a word, you don't lose the audience. And then finally, and this is the strangest one, is that you have to create words that somebody can literally become. And if you think of the lyrics of a lot of great songs, in the first about 10 words, they tell you who you are, something about the weather, about the time of day, about something, and about the person. And they set a scene. And so you've got to create something where the person can inhabit your words, where they came from and where they're going. And I find this really interesting. I find it hard. And I did one opera based on Nosferatu, the F.W. Murnau film. And this is the vampire's love song. One of the great things about writing this is you get to write villains, who are always more interesting than your heroes. And if you remember the film, the woman has to come to him willingly. So the question is, what is the plausible argument that a vampire makes that you should, date him? And so, and so this is Nosferatu's Serenade. And what he comes up with is the notion that, this woman's always been unhappy. She's always felt incomplete and out of place. And it's because she's never acknowledged the darkness inside of herself. And what he does is he brings her, the completion of that darkness, and that's what will link them. Nosferatu's. I should say one thing to this crowd. In general, it's bad to follow a vampire's advice. Nosferatu's Serenade. I am the image that darkens your glass, the shadow that falls wherever you pass. I am the dream you cannot forget, the face you remember without having met. I am the truth that must not be spoken, the midnight vow that cannot be broken. I am the bell that tolls out the hours. I am the fire that warms and devours. I am the hunger that you have denied, the ache of desire piercing your side. I am the sin you have never confessed, the forbidden hand caressing your breast. You've heard me inside you, speak in your dreams, sigh in the ocean, whisper in streams. I am the future you crave and you fear. You know what I bring. Now I am here. Okay, now I'm going to poach on the fiction writers a little bit. Because one of the other things I'm really interested in is telling stories in verse, creating poetic language that is both poetic and yet gives us the pleasures of storytelling. And I think when you do it in a poem, this is a poem that's, it's probably 1/20th the length that it would be if it was a short story. But I think it has, because you're working in a more compressed language, it still has the same amplitude. It is two things. It's a love story and it's a ghost story. The first 3 lines are in italics because it's, this fellow overhearing the story then asking for it. I don't believe in ghosts. It's called Haunted. I don't believe in ghosts, he said. Such nonsense. But years ago, I actually saw one. He seemed quite serious, and so I asked. It happened almost 40 years ago. The world was different then, not just for ghosts. Slower, less frantic. You're too young to know life without cell phones, laptops, satellite. You didn't bring the world with you everywhere. Out in the country, you were quite alone. I was in love with Mara then, if love is the right word for that particular delusion. We were young. We thought we could create a life made only of peak moments. We laughed, we drank, we argued and made love. Our battles were Homeric. Not Homer's heroes, but his gods. Petty, arrogant Olympians, thundering in their egotistic rage. Mara was brilliant, beautiful, refined. She'd walk into a room dressed for the evening and I would lose my breath. She seemed to shine as movie stars shine, made only of light. And did I mention she was rich? And cruel. Do you know what it's like to be in love with someone bad? Not simply bad for you, but slightly evil, You have to decide either to be the victim or accomplice. I'm not the victim type. That's what she liked. I envied her sublime self-confidence. She could freeze someone with a single sentence. Too witty to be rude, yet deeply wounding, impossible to deflect or forget. If I sound slightly bitter, please understand, it is myself I now despise, not Mara. She simply recognized what I desired. Her uncle owned a house up in the Berkshires, not just a summer house, a country manor, 3 stories high with attics, basements, turrets, surrounded by great lawns and sunken gardens, hundreds of wooded acres whispering wealth. We came up for a few days in late autumn, driving through bare woods under a gray sky, the landscape still, no birds, barely a breeze, hushed as the hour after heavy snowfall. The house had been vacated since September. I had expected it to be dark and gothic, cloaked in shadow like something out of Lovecraft. But the decor was opulently cozy, a proper refuge for a robber baron, stuffed with objets to certify his status, though slightly shabby from a century's use. The art was grand, authentic, second-rate. Florentine bronzes, Belgian tapestries, carved stonework pride from bankrupt Tudor manors, and landscapes by the minor Barbizon. Nothing quite fit together. I suspect sumptuous excess was the desired effect. A joyful shout to celebrate success. Good taste be damned. Let's just indulge ourselves and revel like a child who greets his playmates by emptying his toy chest on the floor. What fun is wealth if no one notices? Mara seemed to think so. What did I know? I'd never seen the rich up close before. While Mara showered, I explored the cellars, searching a maze of mildewed storage rooms until I found a faux medieval door, flanked by a pair of somber wooden saints. You should have seen the wine her uncle owned. 6 vaulted rooms stocked with the great estates, bin after bin of legendary names, Chateau Margaux, Latour, Lafitte Rothschild, a prodigal accumulation formed on such a scale he could have entertained Napoleon and half the Grande Armée. I chose 2 bottles of pre-war Patrousse that probably cost as much as my month's rent. Clutching their dusty necks, I closed the door and told the saints I could get used to this. They didn't condescend to give an answer. That night, we drank in the high-paneled library, a great inferno blazing in the fireplace. Naked Diana stood in tapestry above us on the wall. Below her, Mara, stylishly overdressed, refilled our glasses. Resplendently, the room reminded us that beauty always bears a heavy price. White tiger skins lay stretched across the floor, martyred Sebastian twisted on a pedestal. Even the dusty books were bound in leather. Mara loved having me as audience. She sat there, half illumined by the fire and half in shadow, spinning out long stories. They were as fine as anything in books. No, they were better because they were true. She was a connoisseur of schadenfreude and was especially wicked in describing her former lovers, imitating them, cataloging their signature stupidities, and relishing their subsequent misfortunes. I'm surely in her repertory now. At first, I was embarrassed by her candor. I felt more like a confidant than lover. But gradually, I understood the motive. Even she needed someone to impress. Life was a contest. Mara was a champion. What good was winning if no one noticed? Of course, that night we drank too much and argued. She strode off, slamming doors theatrically. I sat still, slowly finishing my drink, feigning indifference, just as she would have. Let her find me. Let her apologize. She won't like sleeping in this house alone. The room was cold, and I was too annoyed to fall asleep. I stretched out on the bed, still wearing all of my clothes, and tried to read. Believe it or not, the book was Shakespeare's sonnets. What sweeter text for wounded vanity. I'd found an old, what sweeter text for wounded vanity. Farewell, thou art too dear for my possessing. I'd found an old edition in the library, and from sheer spitefulness I'd stolen it. That night, each poem seemed written just for me. What is your substance? Whereof are you made that millions of strange shadows on you tend? I hope this explanation makes it clear. I wasn't sleeping when I saw her enter. Mara, I thought, mad at being ignored, coming to make a scene. But no, it was a handsome woman in her early 40s. I thought she might have been a housekeeper coming in from town to check up on the place, but why was she so stylishly dressed? I started to explain why I was there. She didn't seem to hear and turned away. Could she be deaf? I didn't want to scare her. Something was wrong. I couldn't see her clearly. She seemed at once herself and her own reflection, shimmering on the surface of clear water where fleeting shadows twisted in the depths. I found it hard admitting what I saw. She seemed to be a ghost, though that sounds crazy. Oddly, I wasn't scared, just full of wonder, watching this thing I knew could not exist, this woman standing by her dressing table, translucent, insubstantial, but still there, and utterly oblivious of me. First to be haunted, then to be ignored. Her back turned toward me. She started to undress. Now I was panicked and embarrassed both. I spoke much louder. She made no response. Now wearing only a long silk chemise, she turned toward me, still strangely indistinct, the fabric undulating as if alive. I felt her eyes appraise me, and I sat half paralyzed as she approached the bed. Here I was, face to face with a dead soul, some entity regathered from the dust, returned like Lazarus from the silent tomb, whose mere existence right before my eyes confounded my belief there could not be an afterlife. Think of what this meeting represented, a skeptic witnessing the unexplained. I could have learned the secrets of the dead, if there are any secrets, which I doubt. So how did I address this revenant, this traveler from the undiscovered country, who stared at me with dark, unblinking eyes? I caught my breath, got on my feet, and said nothing at all. The words stuck in my throat. We stood there face to face, inches apart. Her pale skin shined like a window catching sunlight, bright and clear, but chilling to the touch. She stared at me with undisguised contempt. Then she whispered, almost in a hiss, "You don't belong here. No, you don't belong here." She slowly reached to touch me, and I ran, leaving behind both Shakespeare and my shoes. Mara was still awake when I arrived. The lamp was on, the fireplace ablaze, and she stretched naked under satin sheets. She could never resist striking pin-up poses. "So you've come back." She yawned with mock ennui, then added with a smirk, "You weren't gone long." I didn't say a word of what I'd seen. We used to sleep in one another's arms, our two slim bodies interlaced like hands. That night I held her, feeling our hearts beat, first hers, then mine, always out of sync. And in the dark, I thought, I don't belong here. I don't belong here. Slipping out of bed, I quickly dressed, and what I couldn't wear I left behind. The books, the clothes, the camera, no longer mine. What a surprise to first feel the liberations of divestiture. I moved with such new lightness down the stairs, watched by mute saints and marble goddesses. Then out the door, I closed it quietly. The lock clicked shut. Goodbye to both my ghosts. I made it to the county road by dawn and hitched a ride on an old dairy truck. "What happened to your shoes?" the driver said. "No, better yet, don't tell me. Just get in." I climbed in, and one road led to another, and now I'm in your bar. That's probably not the story you expected from a monk delivering brandy from the monastery. Not all of us started as altar boys. I've been there 15 years. I like the drill. Poverty, chastity, and growing grapes. The Archbishop calls my port a miracle. Don't tell his grace, but I'm still not sure there is an afterlife. That's not why I stay. This is the life I didn't want to waste. Now I'll just do two more poems. The first is one that is a song, really, or a song-like texture, a transparent texture. It's called Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop-dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's turned lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. And then I'm going to end with a sort of complicated poem that's about both storytelling and love. The two themes are that we lead our lives by stories. As our life changes, we have to change the story of our life. And that's why literature has to become part of everybody's education. You need to have a mind and imagination stocked with the multiplicity of stories, of sudden surprising turns, of new characters, of sort of succeeding despite the odds, of reinventing yourself. And you can tell when somebody's really unhappy, when somebody is really in danger, because they're in a story that they can't move anywhere. The second thing is I think that love, is first of all when you sort of wrap your story around someone else, but that love expresses itself most completely in conversation, in kind of a palaver, that you have, that it's not real until you tell your beloved that something's happened. So this is a poem, I guess, about the imagination and about marriage. I take my title from Shakespeare, which is from Midsummer Night's Dream. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. All three of them are crazy. But Shakespeare goes on to say that in their craziness, they're able to see things that ordinary people can't. The lunatic, let's see if I can do this without a microphone. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet. The tales we tell are either false or true, but neither purpose is the point. We weave the fabric of our own existence out of words, and the right story tells us who we are. Perhaps it is the words that summon us. The tale is often wiser than the teller, There is no naked truth but what we wear. So let me bring this story to our bed. The world, I say, depends upon a spell spoken each night by lovers, unaware of their own sorcery, in innocence or agony. The same words must be spoken, or the restless moon will darken in the sky, the night grows still, the winds of dawn expire. And if I'm wrong, it cannot be by much. We know our own existence came from touch, the new soul summoned into life by lust, and love's shy tongue awakens in such fire, flesh on flesh and midnight whispering, as if the only purpose of desire were to explore its infinite unfolding. And so, my love, we are two lunatics, secretaries to the wordless moon, lying awake together or apart, transcribing every touch or aching absence into our endless, intimate palaver, body to body, naked to the night, apparelled only in our utterance. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, that's thank you. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You recited Haunted at the pre-reception a week or so ago. After that, I went to Extraordinary Lakes to find and the downtown library no longer carries the Hudson Review. August 2007, it stopped in February. Budget crisis, I suppose. I've never been connected to USC, so then I went to UCLA, where I often hang out. And they had 2 years of Hudson Review.
We should just call it Hudson and save all that gas.
Well, in the vault of the reference library, they had 2 years, but for some reason, the August issue had been stolen. So I managed to find
There are fans everywhere.
So I'm assuming because it's your phone, somebody found it and had to keep it. But when I found the version that was printed in Hudson Review of 2010, it did not have the segment on the descent into the wine cellar, which is marvelous because the whole thing is about spirits. And of course, the wines are spirits. And you've got the monk on the onset saying, I don't believe in spirits, but I'm serving spirits. So I just wanted to say a comment about how you decided later to attach the portion of the descent into the wine cellar.
I am impressed by both your indefatigable research and your sagacious readings. Let me get off my high horse here. I am an obsessive, neurotic poet, and I often revise my poems. I mean, here's my composition process. I won't go into my creative process because it's simply too ugly and depressing. But let us assume that I've now begun to poem. I try, especially now, to write as much of it as possible in the air. I just walk around and doing this and hearing the sound, and it gives a different texture to the poems. And then I sort of and I write it out. Now a longer narrative poem is harder to do this. And then when I finally do it, it's all in fountain pen on foolscap. And then there comes a point where I think it's close to being done, and then I put it in the typewriter. And when I do that, it's the same way like when I take it out of air and I put it in my handwriting, I see it differently. Suddenly, I see it very differently. Then I begin to work on it. Then when I think it's done, then I take it to the computer. And then I put it out there, and then I see it as if it's written by somebody else, and it does. Then my problem is that every time I send a poem to an editor now, they accept it. And so there's nobody telling me that you're really awful, And when a poet needs this. And so then when it came out, and And I read it. I felt it worked, but I wanted to spend a little more time with the man, because you were seeing him mostly through this woman, through this relationship with the woman. And I also wanted to make sure that you understood that he was no better than she was. It's not that these are two people that are bringing out the worst in each other. And so I created this, and then I began playing with it. I didn't know where he was going. I just knew that he was going to go down there. And believe it or not, those, what is it, about 12 lines maybe, probably went through 50 drafts. And then I finally felt that I got it right. And then I cut some other things in the poem and changed a few other lines. And I do this quite in my publisher. I mean, like a long narrative poem that's in the Gods of Winter, I completely rewrote in proof. I cut about 10% of it out, put new things in, and it was better for it. And so I believe that Paul Valéry's thing, that a poem is never finished, it is only abandoned. So, but so you'll have to wait till April. Because I give you a text tonight, but it probably won't be what it eventually appears. So, well, here's the thing about poems. The world has an infinite number of bad poems. So if you throw one more on the heap, it's futile. So it's one of these it's a tight wire walk, and so you're really trying for a certain level of expressivity, And I really do believe one bad moment can undercut a poem. You can have a magnificent poem, and it's one stupid, one misstep, you lose. Because what you're trying to do in a poem is to create a spell. And if you can bring people into that spell, what I'm trying to do is to say, I'm going to give you a story that's about 3/4 done. And if I put the spell on it, you're going to give me the other quarter from your life. And that's why poetry is harder to read, because you got to push a little more deeply into it. A novelist kind of fills out the details and things like that, and they kind of carry you along. But the poet really asks you to do a lot more work. And so that's what I'm always trying to figure out, what is the thing that can create that spell where I bring the person, want the person to enter the world of the poem with me. And it's hard. At least I find it hard. Maybe some people don't. Another question. Your question is so well-informed, intimidating, I think, yes.
You started your reading this evening with words, and today I was looking at palabras, and I was wondering...
Oh, you saw it in Spanish?
Yeah.
That wonderful translation by Jose Emilio Pacheco.
I'm sorry?
That wonderful translation by Jose Emilio Pacheco.
Okay.
I mean, the greatest living Mexican poet is, that was
it was beautiful, and I didn't realize, I was reading it online, and it didn't really give that credit. And so I was wondering, I wasn't sure, because I knew that was your background, so I didn't know if you also wrote the Spanish.
Well, no, it should have been. I mean, I think what happened, I've inserted the translation names again and again. Some of them keep getting lost. And,
right.
I don't know.
So you write in English.
I write in English with difficulty.
Yes. And then, so
this is the beauty of Spanish. I mean, poem in English, words, nothing. Palabras. That's a great, just the title is already better. But no, I've been very lucky. I've been widely translated, often by very good poets. Curiously, my worst translations are all into Italian. And I don't, which is sort of surprising, But the Spanish, I've been particularly like the Spanish and Russian. I think she was first, and then you next. Okay.
So many times poets write in the first-person perspective, but one thing I found difficult in reading this book was that I was never sure when it was you talking to me or if you were taking on a persona. And so I'm wondering if that was intentional or if you feel like it's just all coming from you.
You're very, very, very wise. I write almost no poems that are autobiographical. There's about 4 poems maybe that are autobiographical that I've ever published. And I'll tell you why. Everything that happens to me is wonderful or heartbreaking or unfair, and you really should care about it. And it's what Yeats said. And you go, oh God, what a drip, And the only way I can get any perspective on myself is to create something, and every poem's got something of mine in it, or whatever, But it's, usually I take 5 different experiences. I mean, Haunted, about 2/3 of Haunted is something that happened, but not the same thing, not the same, one estate, one girlfriend, this, that, and the other. I'm not yet taken holy orders. That who knows, and so what I try to do is I try to create a kind of fiction. But and the funny thing is, by making it a fiction, I can pour my heart out. I can reveal things I would never reveal if I was being autobiographical. So it's very deliberate, and I think that for me, it's the precondition of being able to write emotionally without being, self-indulgent or self-pitying or whatever. So, and then sometimes it's very clearly a persona,
Okay, I have to sort of kind of read this because my wine is making my memory go away. But
the more wine my audience has, the happier I am. Happier they are too.
But in the essay of it, Important Matter, which we pretty much, I guess, all read, you say that poets and the common reader are no longer on speaking terms. And I love poetry, and I write. I'm not a poet, but I write some. And but I find that a lot of times poems that are supposed to be the best, meaning they win awards and they get all kinds of accolades, I don't have a clue what they're talking about. And I read them and I go through them and study them and look for clues and all the things you're supposed to do, but I don't have a clue.
Yeah.
So I just wonder how, if people, because I'm one of the smart kids, which I don't mind admitting at all. How do people who aren't English majors and aren't getting their master's degrees in some kind of writing program, how are they supposed to be on speaking terms with poetry when they don't have, it's like a foreign language.
You're asking a very important question. But there's several questions sort of folded into each other. Let me start with one. And there's a moment in the essay, if you've read the whole essay, where I very specifically, because people would say, well, you expect everybody to be reading Wallace Stevens. And I said, well, let's just talk about, I think it was 2% of the U.S. population, which is about 6 million people. And, if you're in a society where your doctors, your lawyers, your ministers, your scientists, your novelists, your architects, your musicians have no relationship to poetry, it just shows you. It's not just a matter of not the common person, but the intelligent, alert, curious readers have been lost. Now, so that's first. It's just a sociological observation. Secondly, I believe, and I said this when I was in office as NEA chairman. I think we believe we live in a broken culture. We have this tremendous artistic talent in the United States, this extraordinary richness across the arts, and somehow it is not reaching people. And even more interestingly, the people that are the guardians, the curators, the critics, the gatekeepers of this, are something like my Archbishop. They're doing what is best for their career, not what is best, for their, not just their audiences, but for their potential audiences. I mean, I do not write poems for the people who read poetry. I write poems for people. I write poems, for thinking, feeling, adolescents and adults. I mean, and which is to say, I write for people. I hope to write for people I summon into an audience. And so I think that the gatekeeping function is collapsed. We've got a culture. The media tells us what's important. Listen to an hour of AM radio. You hear traffic, you hear news, you hear food, you hear politics, you hear money, you hear sports, you hear entertainment. You can drive all year and you won't hear about the arts. You won't hear about serious ideas. You won't hear about science. These are not considered important in our society. Now, you need some science after a while because you don't want to die and you want to be able to blow up your enemies. But so they have to keep the scientists off there someplace. But if they could sort of export all the artists in the United States, probably a lot of people would be happy about it, or they wouldn't even care about it. So the question is, how do we create a culture? It's not just poetry. The interesting thing about this article is within about a year, people were publishing, does history matter? Does children's poetry matter? Does jazz matter? Does painting matter? Because people understood that the situation I was describing was true across all the arts. So we are in a society which does not value what we do, which does not love what we love. Now, there's two possible explanations. We're all crazy, and from some of my writer friends, you can make a very compelling argument that these people they're just nuts and they're not to be trusted. Or you can say, what has gone wrong that things that we know are of potentially such value haven't been brought into people's lives, haven't been brought into educations, haven't been brought into communities. And I think that's really the work of the 21st century. Now, you can do the whole sociology of how it happened in the 20th century, but being in a university, I think we can see something very, very clearly. That by the end of the 20th century, the arts had been kind of sequestered into these little groups of specialists. Your program is kind of interesting because you actually have people talking across genres. That doesn't even exist in some departments, And so the poets only talk to the poets, the anthropologists only talk about the anthropologists, this, that, and the other. Now, I was raised by people who did not speak English as a native language for the most part. And they would just watch variety shows. And if they left the TV on because they fell asleep, a talk show would come on. In the variety shows, when I was a kid, you'd have Shecky Green, doing his Borscht Belt comedy, but then you'd have Louis Armstrong, you'd have Dizzy Gillespie, you'd have Duke Ellington. You say, okay, well, jazz was popular music, Dina. That's just, these were great American musicians. But then you'd have Jascha Heifetz, you'd have Arthur Rubinstein, you'd have Anna Moffo singing opera. You knew the Jewish holidays had come around because Richard Tucker would come and sing an opera aria and a Jewish cantorials, song or something like this. You knew, that Christmas or Easter was around because they'd have, Anna Moffo sing an aria and a Christmas thing. And it was assumed then that the arts were of interest to the average people. Then if you stayed at the talk show, they would have a comedian come on, but then they'd have Carl Sandburg come on. They'd have Robert Frost come on. They'd have Eric Hoffer, the philosopher, come on. They'd have Linus Pauling come on. They'd have Margaret Mead come on and talking about anthropology. When's the last time you saw an anthropologist on Jay Leno? It's inconceivable. Everybody on Jay Leno and David Letterman, why are they there? They're there because they have a commercial product, a film, an album, a TV show, a product that it's coming out that week that they're selling you. We have allowed every inch of our media to be commercialized. And for people they're not interested in it. They're only interested in buying things, is what they're telling us. So this is the culture we're in. And part of the reason that it's that bad is our fault. The intellectuals have failed to engage the general populace. The artists have failed it because the sociology of the 20th, the surrealist poem, the sociology of the 20th century was for us to épiter la bourgeoisie, to create these little kingdoms, So you get tenure, you're in a department, the state is supporting you meagerly, and so you just, you sort of opt out. And so I think I think everything you say is is true, and it's even worse than what you're saying. But we have. But the way we do it is by our own actions. If we don't do it, no one else will. So, yeah.
I was wondering if this actually might build on your response to that. But I got through Can Poetry Matter and then saw Copyright in 1991, and I didn't realize that it was written 20 years ago. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about what changes you've perceived or have seen at all.
Can I make a question to you? Sure. Does it seem to you still true?
Absolutely. It seemed, I thought it was.
Isn't that sad?
Written this week.
So if you had something, can we cure malaria 20 years ago and it was still like the same thing? So no, there have been changes every week for the last, usually every day, but every week for the last 20 years I got a letter from a stranger saying, I've just read Can Poetry Matter, and it's explained things to me, and what are we going to do? So there's still people deciding, and actually today I got it's a big article in Salon about, you should send us the article about essentially the collapse of a sort of an independent artist, a freelance lifestyle, about how hard it is to do this. And this person says, Dana Gioia has made many enemies, and it was a little click. And I said, well, I don't know who my enemy is. And I clicked, but it clicks to Can Poetry Matter? Because I was completely blackballed by the poetry establishment for a decade because of that article. Which was fine, because I made my living elsewhere. You know, I was writing for the BBC and things like that. You know, they did me a favor. You know, but here, what I would say is this. Most of the sociology that I talk about the isolation of the artists and the effects of the academization of the artist is still very true. The corruption of reviewing is still true. The corruption of anthologies. And this is really what you're talking about. You know why these poems are so bad? They're publishing their friends. They're publishing. I've been on prize committees. These are major prize committees where somebody comes up to me and says, you know, we've got to give Bill the prize. Because, you know, Bill never forgets his friends. In fact, and I had one case where Bill actually showed up and offered me a job. This is a very famous poet whose name you recognize, a very famous poet. That's how open the corruption is. And don't for him believe it isn't true. You know, so I had to make a decision about 20 years ago whether I wanted to get prizes and be famous or I wanted to be honest. And you know, I'm just not good at lying, so I had no choice. I had to be honest. And so, you know, you take a different thing. So most of it's still true. Now, what is different is I made a bunch of suggestions at the back of that, and you'd be surprised how many thousands of people have acted on that. And I know because they write me letters. The most interesting one is I was on the Charlie Rose show talking about this article, and the other guest was a guy named Garrison Keillor. And Keillor, you know, we're talking about this, and he says, you know, he read the article, it was very interesting, we begin to talk, and then a year later, he starts Writer's Almanac and reads a poem a day, which I think is one of the most powerful things in American poetry right now, is Garrison Keillor. And he's as important as the Academy of American Poets, because he reaches this, you know, he has vast reach. So I think the main difference is that the non-academic literary culture has grown healthier. But the academic culture, which really should be the gold standard, that should be leading these things, has really, it's almost retreated even further.
It almost seems like a lot of, particularly fiction and FA programs, sort of have dwelled further into it.
Yeah, and some of the things I predicted, which is the fact that the reviews were growing so, you know, they were so corrupt and so congratulatory, and the poetry was people trading favors, that more and more editors would stop publishing is now true. I mean, there's almost, you know, when I was my first book, I got about 30 reviews. I mean, Seamus Heaney doesn't get 30 reviews now. I mean, because there's just not that many places that review. You know, unless you count, you know, Joe's Blog, you know. But you should read this piece it's by Scott Timberg in L.A. He was an L.A. Times culture writer on Salon, you know, that's about this. Anyway, I talk too much. I'm too long-winded. Yeah.
When you talk about reimagining your life,
Yeah.
what part of that is pragmatic and strategic, and what part of that is just will?
It's both. You know, I mean, if I wanted to become, you know, a famous, you know, nude male model, I think it would be an unfortunate decision, you know? I don't know if it was ever not too late, but certainly it's now too late. And so, I think what it is that, I mean, let me start by something real simple. And this is the advice I give people, and I give it to myself. You know, there's certain practical things you can do to make a living. You know, certain, you can, whatever, for different people, the different things. But is it practical to be unhappy? And so I don't think it's ever practical to put yourself into a career, into a position, into a specialization which you dislike, because every day of your life will be unhappy, or not maybe unhappy, but will not. And there's something I noticed, and I spent 15 years in business, which were interesting years. They were not happy years in terms of my daily work, but you know, it was a good company, and I worked hard. But I noticed that most people that you talk to, most adults you talk to, are tired. They're slightly cranky, or not cranky, they're touchy, they're tired. They've just been through the ringer. And this is why. If you are in a life which every day you're doing the wrong work, it takes most of your energy just to push yourself through that life, just to keep yourself together. And once you find yourself in your right life, once you stand on the ground and you feel balanced, you would be astonished at the levels of vitality and energy that you have. And you can physically feel it after you make these changes. So that's the first thing. The second thing really depends. I mean, I don't think, I've been terribly unsuccessful in planning a lot of my life. Almost everything I plan doesn't happen, But by making a plan and putting yourself in a place where things happen, other good things happen. The only thing that I've kept constant over these many years has been trying to create a space always to write poetry, usually against the odds in terms of having a very, very busy life. And sometimes I've had to literally, do very weird things to do that. But I think that, if you can find yourself I'm putting myself in a better place, or I'm going to try something, and it will open up other opportunities. And you'd be surprised. I mean, you find songwriters that wanted to be performers, and performers that wanted to be songwriters, and painters that wanted to be sculptors, and gallery owners that wanted to be painters. But they kind of put themselves in a world, and that world then brought them to a place where they're doing the kind of work they like. I mean, the beauty of life, and if you've been in school, the younger people, this is more to you. If you've been in school most of your life, you don't know how rich the world is in occupations, in opportunities to work. There's things that you don't even know about that are wonderful, And so if you're just finding yourself, I could just tell you stories of some of my friends that have ended up, wonderfully well in ways they would never predicted. But I think part of it is just to have the courage to walk away from unhappiness, courage to walk away from a life which is inauthentic, and then reach towards something. And you fail once or twice, you just start over. It's harder when you have kids because you feel like you have to protect them, little buggers. Any more questions? Okay, sir.
You mentioned earlier on about good poetry and bad poetry, and I must say that I mostly have read nonfiction in recent years, so I haven't read a lot of poetry. How would you tell me what's the difference between a good poem and a bad poem? Are there some principles you could point out? Or?
Yeah. I'm not one of these everything is beautiful in its own way, folks. It's not this ugly. This way, which is to say, there are many types of expressive power, of literary power. I mean, if you're sort of like Helen Vendler, it was interesting. Helen Vendler brought this anthology out. It was directly in competition with one of mine. My publisher was just totally crazy. Oh my God! And so let me see it. And I read through it. I wrote the publisher, don't worry, this is going to fizzle. Well, why? I said, well, it's all Helen Vendler. It's all about language exploring the limits of its own ability to express. I said, there's not one funny poem in it. There's not one love poem in it. There's not any straightforward poem about death in it. I said, this is you give this to undergraduates, their eyes are going to glaze over. No teacher would use it twice. And so and so the thing is, first of all, you have to say that what poetry is a language, and like a language, it can say everything in human experience. Now, at some literary ages, they like to say one thing and they don't like to say another. So if you accommodate that, say any theme is possible, any subject matter is possible, what makes a really good poem is the power of its expressivity. Does it make you laugh? Does it make you cry? Does it make you feel inside another person's? Its memorability and its personality. It took me years to understand what that is, but almost all art, and even the arts that aren't like this, I'll make another argument, almost all art is about creating a connection between two people. And you feel like when you're reading a writer, when you feel the personality, you feel an authentic connection with another human being. It allows you to open up yourself and make that connection. And so so some people can write rather well, but there's a sort of anonymous quality to this. You know, it's not at all about being confessional or autobiographical. It's about, in a sense, having a voice, a kind of a framework. And you see it in young writers. The young writer will write this, write that, then suddenly there's something that just works. And it tends to be because they've got, you know, their style, their subject matter, and themselves together for the first time. And then suddenly something happens, a kind of flow that happens. Bad writing, I think, tends to be wordy, boring, pretentious. It tends to write in the style of the moment rather than actually be able to create a way of saying, saying things. You know, a great poet is like a great singer. You can recognize Sinatra's voice. There's no way you would mistake Billie Holiday for another singer. And she takes away, she imbues all of the, of the thing. So anyway, maybe. Okay. Okay, once you guard the food, I'll take one more question.
Thanks. You talked about your process of paper, typewriter to computer. What about your voice? What about saying it aloud? I'm wondering.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I begin mostly by talking to myself.
Okay.
You know, and I really do. And the poems begin as sounds in the air, and then I copy them on just a little piece. I have a little pocket, thing, and I just, I take long walks and do it. In fact, I think this is a poet talking, not a novelist. I mean, you don't want to bring the word processing into words like this. I think that if I can bring my body into the poem is smarter. There's things that my body knows that my head has forgotten. And so, and part of it is the physicality of sound and rhythm and things like that. So that's really more and more where it begins, for me. And my sense of poetry is almost entirely as a musical art, as an auditory art. So let me end with this. Somebody asked me to read this poem. It's only 6 lines long, so you don't have to worry too much. But I'll tell you a story about it. I was asked some years ago to write a poem about New Year's Day for NPR. And so I wrote an elegant 36-line poem about the idea of New Year's. And we recorded it. And then I was going to send it out to publishing. I said, well, let me tighten this a little bit. And so I tightened it. It went to about 32 lines. And then I worked on it for another, couple weeks. And it went to 28 lines, to 24 lines, to 20 lines. It was too long at 20 lines. And so I began working on it. It went to 18 to 16. I was hoping it would sort of come to 14 and I could call it a sonnet. Didn't. It went to 12, so I missed it. And it went to 10, and then it down to 8. And at 8, I realized it was prolix and verbose. So I cut it down, and it became only 6 lines. But it was no longer had anything to do with New Year's. And that's the secret life of poems, is that there's something that's leading you. And what it instead was a poem about how most of our lives are invisible to anyone else. It's called Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead. Thank you so much.